Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about a what-if scenario that could completely unravel the Warhammer 40k universe as we know it. The Necrons, those ancient soulless lords of living metal, have always been a shadow looming over the galaxy, a force so old that even the oldest star maps struggle to remember the days before them. They are the silent kings and undying soldiers that emerged from their tomb worlds to reclaim what they believe is rightfully theirs. But here's the twist. What if they never woke up? What if the galaxy kept spinning, wars kept raging, and the Necron legions remained buried, their stasis crypts sealed for eternity? The idea might sound like a small detail at first, just remove one faction from the board. But the Necrons are not just another faction. Their awakening is one of the key pivots of the 41st millennium, shifting the balance of power in ways both obvious and subtle. Without them, the galaxy wouldn't simply be safer. It would be different. Entire campaigns wouldn't have happened, alliances might never have formed, and some enemies could have grown far bolder without an immortal machine empire breathing down their necks. And for us fans, that's where the real fun begins, because when you pull a thread in 40k lore, you never know how far it will unravel. Maybe the Tyranids would have swallowed half the galaxy by now. Maybe the Eldar wouldn't be living in constant fear of the Silent King's grand designs. Maybe the Imperium would have collapsed under different pressures, or maybe it would be stronger without yet another ancient doom to fight. This isn't just removing a chess piece, it's changing the entire shape of the game board. So let's dive into this thought experiment. Peel back the layers of history and explore the galaxy that might have been if the Necrons had simply stayed asleep, their tombs undisturbed and their dynasties forever silent. In the official timeline of Warhammer 40k, the Necrons' awakening wasn't some sudden, random event. It was the slow, inevitable breaking of a dam that had held for millions of years. The Necrons had gone to sleep at the end of the war in heaven, when their Citan masters were shattered and their dynasties fractured. They retreated into stasis crypts, buried deep under the crust of countless worlds, hidden beneath layers of rock, ruins, and even thriving alien civilizations that had no idea what slept beneath their feet. For ages, they were just whispers and ancient myths, strange metallic skeletons carved into temple walls by civilizations that no longer exist. Their return began not with a roar, but with tremors. Tomb worlds began to stir because of two main catalysts: the shifting tides of the galaxy and the careless hands of younger species. Wars, planetary bombardments, mining operations, and even natural cosmic events cracked open some of those tomb complexes. In other cases, automated Necron protocols simply decided it was time to wake, sensing that the galaxy had grown ripe for reclamation. And once the first dynasties emerged, it was like a chain reaction. More and more tomb worlds followed, each adding another cold, calculated threat to the galaxy's already desperate struggle for survival. Without that awakening, a huge chunk of the 41st millennium's danger profile just vanishes. The Imperium would never have had to face worlds being stripped bare by unstoppable legions of living metal. The ghostly, silent fleets that appeared seemingly out of nowhere would never have stalked Imperial shipping lanes. Famous battles like the fall of Sanctuary 101 or the War for Damnos would simply not exist in this alternate timeline. Even the psychological effect would be gone, because the Necrons weren't just a physical threat. They were a reminder that humanity's supposed dominion over the stars was nothing more than a fleeting claim in a galaxy still ruled by ancient powers. And here's the strange part. Many fans agree that in the absence of the Necron awakening, the galaxy would feel emptier. The Necrons brought a kind of existential dread that was very different from chaos. Chaos is loud, it's corrupted, it's a firestorm of madness and violence. Necrons are the opposite: quiet, inevitable, unfeeling. Their war isn't about rage or ambition. It's about a slow, methodical reclamation, like the tide swallowing a beach grain by grain. Without them, that entire tone is missing. The galaxy becomes a little less cold, a little less alien. Another thing that disappears is the technological arms race that their return forced on other factions. The Necrons' Gauss weaponry, their ability to teleport, and their near-indestructible forms forced Imperial and alien strategists alike to rethink entire doctrines. In a galaxy where they never wake, those adaptations never happen. The Adeptus Mechanicus might not push certain technological limits without that metallic shadow looming over them. The Tau, who clashed with Necrons on multiple occasions, might never develop specific countermeasures to deal with such high-level threats. Some fans speculate that without the Necrons' rise, the Silent King would remain in exile, drifting in the void, and the galaxy would be spared his grand design to shepherd the Necron race back to full dominance. Others think the Silent King might still act, but on a much smaller, more secretive scale, using proxy agents or subtle manipulations instead of outright military campaigns. In either case, the sheer scale of war that their awakening unleashed would be gone, and with it, countless ripples that shaped the modern state of the galaxy. It's also worth noting that many of the conflicts that woke dormant dynasties would simply proceed without that unintended consequence. The Orcs could smash a world to pieces without accidentally cracking open a tomb. The Imperium could bombard a rebellious planet without triggering the rise of a Necron lord who would then turn on both sides. That chain of cause and effect moments where someone thinks they've won, only to discover they've just unleashed something worse, would largely vanish from the lore. In this alternate timeline, the galaxy's history takes a different course from the very moment the first dynasty would have awoken. Entire campaigns, from small sector wars to major crusades, wouldn't just play out differently. They might not happen at all. The map of influence shifts, not because someone wins a war, but because one of the galaxy's greatest predators never stirs from its slumber. It's a quieter, perhaps even deceptively safer galaxy, but one where the absence of that cold, methodical threat would allow other dangers to grow unchecked. And that's where things start to get truly interesting for the rest of our thought experiment. For the Imperium of Man, the absence of the Necrons would be like removing a constant, gnawing pressure from its already overburdened existence. The Imperium's strategic thinking is shaped not just by the wars it is fighting, but by the threats it knows are lurking just beyond its reach. When the Necrons awoke, they forced the High Lords, Segmentum commands, and countless planetary governors to stretch already thin resources into entirely new theaters of war. Without that obligation, those resources could have been redirected into other critical fronts, perhaps altering the outcomes of conflicts that, in the real timeline, ended in disaster. Imagine the Crusade fleets not being pulled from orc-infested sectors to deal with a sudden Necron incursion in some forgotten corner of the galaxy. Think about how many Astra Militarum regiments never would have been chewed apart on barren tomb worlds where the enemy didn't tire, didn't break, and didn't surrender. Without those distractions, the Imperium might have been able to press its campaigns harder against the Tyranids, reinforce fragile borders against chaos, or crush uprisings before they could escalate into full-blown rebellions. Even the Astartes chapters, often seen as irreplaceable strategic assets, would have been spared from brutal attrition on worlds like Damnos or Sanctuary 101. There's also the matter of logistics, something that fans often overlook but which dictates so much of the Imperium's capacity to wage war. The Necron threat forced the Administratum to divert resources to garrison planets that had previously been considered secure, just in case a tomb world was hiding beneath them. Without that paranoia, those worlds could have been defended more lightly, freeing up manpower, ships, and supply lines for other conflicts. Convoys wouldn't need to reroute around suspected Necron territories. Forge worlds wouldn't have been forced to redesign certain armaments specifically to counter Necron technology. The psychological shift might have been just as significant. The Imperium's leaders live in a constant state of triage, deciding which threats to confront and which to ignore until they grow too large to avoid. Removing the Necrons from the equation could give them a sense, however fleeting, that the galaxy's dangers were at least manageable. That mental breathing room could lead to more aggressive offensives against known enemies, instead of the reactive, defensive posture that so often defines Imperial strategy in the current timeline. Some fans speculate that this absence could have made the Imperium overconfident, perhaps dangerously so. Without the chilling reminder that there are still ancient powers far beyond human understanding, the High Lords might underestimate other threats. The Tyranids, for example, might have been dismissed for too long, allowing them to consume more of the eastern fringe before serious countermeasures were taken. Or the forces of chaos might have found less resistance in certain sectors, because Imperial planners weren't constantly reminded that something as seemingly indestructible as the Necrons could emerge at any time. On the other hand, others believe that without the constant bleeding of resources into Necron conflicts, the Imperium could have mounted larger and more decisive victories elsewhere. Campaigns like the defense of Cadia might have been reinforced enough to change the tide, or perhaps the Macarian Crusade could have been sustained for longer, pushing Imperial borders farther than ever before. Entire sectors that fell to alien or heretical forces in the canon timeline might have remained firmly under Imperial control. Economically, the absence of Necrons also means less disruption to mining and industrial operations. The Imperium relies on an unbroken chain of production from hive worlds, agri-worlds, and forge worlds. In the canon timeline, Necron activity often severs those chains, stripping planets bare or wiping out their populations entirely. Without that interference, the Imperium's war machine might run a little smoother. Its titanic demands for munitions, ships, and soldiers met with slightly less desperation. However, it's important to remember that the Imperium thrives in its own twisted way under constant threat. The cult of the Emperor frames every external danger as proof of humanity's need for unity under his will. The Necrons, as an unknowable and alien foe, provided the ecclesiarchy with another example to rally the faithful against. Without them, the propaganda shifts. There's one less perfect example of an utterly godless, soulless enemy to point to when preaching about the righteousness of the imperial cause. Some in the fan community even suggest that this could slightly weaken the cultural glue that binds the Imperium together in the face of endless war. In this imagined galaxy, the Imperium of Man is still beset by threats on all sides, but the removal of the Necron menace subtly changes the rhythm of its wars. There's more room to breathe, more flexibility to act, and perhaps, just perhaps, more opportunities to win. Yet history in the 41st millennium has a way of filling any vacuum with something worse, and without the Necrons claiming their share of the galaxy's blood, that space might be taken by foes even less predictable. For the Eldari, the Necrons are more than just another galactic predator. They are living reminders of the war in heaven, a conflict so ancient and catastrophic that it still shapes Eldari identity millions of years later. To the younger races, the Necrons are terrifying because of their technology and their relentlessness. To the Eldari, they are terrifying because they were once the near extinction of their entire species. That ancestral trauma shapes how the craft worlds, the Corsairs, and even the shadowy Harlequins interact with the galaxy. Removing the Necrons from the modern era means removing a huge part of the Eldari's cultural and strategic focus. In this alternate reality, where the tomb worlds remain sealed, the Eldari wouldn't need to waste resources on monitoring known Necron sites or responding to sudden awakenings. In the current timeline, craft world seers often divert fleets to prevent ancient Necron sites from falling into the wrong hands or to stop the awakening of a dynasty before it becomes a threat. Without that burden, those same fleets could be redirected toward reclaiming lost maiden worlds, striking at Orc incursions before they spread, or even taking bolder actions against chaos strongholds. There's also the question of how this would affect their psychological state. Many fans point out that the Eldari live in a constant state of low-grade paranoia. It's not just chaos they fear. It's the knowledge that the ancient enemies they barely survived once could rise again at any moment. If the Necrons never awoke, some of that ancient dread might fade over generations, especially among the younger Eldari who have never fought them. This could lead to a cultural shift away from the deep caution that defines craftworld strategy and toward a more assertive, expansionist mindset. The Eldari might once again take greater risks, potentially reshaping the balance of power in the galaxy. Without the Necrons' resurgence, the Eldari's enemies would change too. The Orcs, for example, often clash with both Eldari and Necrons. If the Necrons are gone, those Orc forces are free to focus more heavily on Eldari-held worlds. That could create a more dangerous frontier in certain sectors, forcing the Eldari to fight more conventional grinding wars rather than the surgical strikes they prefer. On the other hand, without Necrons claiming resource-rich or strategically vital systems, the Eldari might have an easier time securing key points in the galaxy before anyone else can. There's also a ripple effect on the Harlequins. Their sacred duty is to guard the Black Library and manipulate events to protect the Eldari race from ultimate destruction. The Necrons' return, with their potential to disrupt the balance between the warp and real space, has been one of the threats they monitor closely. Without that danger, the Harlequins might shift their attention more toward chaos incursions or even toward manipulating younger races like the Tau to act as buffers against other threats. Some fans even speculate that in such a galaxy, the Harlequins could take on a more aggressive role, intervening directly in events instead of relying so heavily on subtlety and misdirection. One of the more interesting theories is that, without the Necron menace, certain craft worlds might be willing to coordinate more openly with human forces. In the real timeline, the Eldari sometimes find themselves fighting on the same side as the Imperium when Necrons are involved, not out of friendship, but out of shared necessity. Without that unifying danger, those rare moments of cooperation might disappear entirely, making the relationship between humans and Eldari even more antagonistic. This could mean fewer opportunities for the Eldari to manipulate human military campaigns for their own ends. Another consequence is the fate of ancient Eldari artifacts and sites. Many Necron awakenings in the canon timeline threaten ruins or structures from the height of the Eldari Empire, forcing desperate recovery missions before they're destroyed or captured. In a galaxy where the Necrons sleep forever, those relics have a much higher chance of survival. That could allow the Eldari to preserve more of their heritage, restore ancient technologies, or even revive fragments of their pre-fall culture. For a species clinging to the remnants of a shattered golden age, this could be an incredible advantage. Of course, not every fan sees this as a good thing. Some argue that without the Necrons to keep them cautious, the Eldari might overextend themselves, repeating the hubris that led to their near annihilation in the first place. Power without fear has been the downfall of the Eldari before, and in this scenario, history could easily repeat itself. The galaxy without Necrons might not give the Eldari a brighter future. It might just accelerate their final decline under different circumstances. In any case, their story would be rewritten in profound ways. Instead of a people constantly reminded of their ancient defeat by a still-living enemy, they become a people haunted only by the memory, free to act without that immediate shadow. Whether that freedom leads to rebirth or ruin would depend entirely on how they choose to use it. The Tyranids are a force of nature unlike anything else in the galaxy. They don't conquer for territory, ideology, or revenge. They consume endlessly and without pause. Every world they devour fuels their evolution. Every battle reshapes them into more efficient predators. In the current timeline, the Necrons act as a kind of unintentional roadblock to their advance. Tomb worlds are often the last places a Tyranid hive fleet wants to stumble into, because Necrons don't offer biomass, and their technological defenses can tear apart a swarm before it has time to adapt. Remove the Necrons from the equation, and that roadblock disappears. Without those dead worlds coming to life in a storm of gauss fire, the Tyranids gain access to entire swaths of the galaxy that would have been off-limits or costly to attack. The Eastern Fringe, for example, contains multiple Necron dynasties that have clashed with Tyranid tendrils. Those battles not only destroyed countless Tyranids, but also delayed their progress, forcing them to divert and seek easier prey. In an alternate reality where the Necrons never woke, the Tyranids could push through those regions unhindered, hitting Imperial, Eldari, or even Orc-held systems far sooner and in greater force. There's also the question of adaptability. The Tyranids learn from every encounter, and Necron technology doesn't give them much to work with. Fighting against living metal is a poor training ground for evolving biological countermeasures. Without those sterile battles, the Tyranids would instead face more organic opponents, allowing them to harvest genetic material and develop specialized strains at a much faster rate. This could lead to more dangerous bioforms emerging earlier in their galactic invasion. Imagine the horrors of creatures adapted from Orc resilience, Eldari agility, or even the psychic talents of human psykers, appearing decades or even centuries before they would in the original timeline. Some fans have theorized that the Tyranids might actually expand more cautiously if they never encountered the Necrons. The logic goes that the Necrons, being such a direct and unyielding threat, force the hive mind to commit to high-intensity warfare that strengthens the swarm's collective resolve. Without that challenge, the Tyranids might underestimate the galaxy's defenders and risk overextension. But honestly, looking at the way the Tyranids operate, most agree that the opposite would happen. They'd become bolder, hungrier, and more efficient. Without the constant attrition of Necron resistance, they'd simply have more biomass to work with, and more biomass means bigger fleets, larger planetary assaults, and a faster pace of galactic consumption. The absence of Necrons also affects the way other factions respond to Tyranids. Right now, the Imperium sometimes benefits from the fact that the Tyranids are busy smashing themselves against a toon world somewhere far away. That breathing room allows the Astra Militarum to regroup, the Astartes to launch counteroffensives, and the Adeptus Mechanicus to develop countermeasures. Without that buffer, Tyranid pressure on Imperial borders would be relentless, and relief fleets would have far fewer opportunities to catch their breath. For the Eldari, the loss of that buffer could be even worse. Tyranids have no interest in their ancient grudges, only in their flesh and psychic essence. And without the Necrons' interference, the craft worlds could find themselves facing hive fleets far more frequently. Even the Orcs, who thrive on constant war, might feel the difference. Orcs sometimes fight Necrons, but it's a fight they can't win in the traditional sense. The Tyranids, on the other hand, provide endless, deliciously destructive battles, and the Orcs just keep growing from them. Without Necrons siphoning off some of the Tyranids' attention, the Orcs could end up in a strange feedback loop with the swarm, each side feeding the other's growth in different ways. The galaxy could see entire sectors turn into meat grinders of green and chitin, with neither side backing down. There's also the darker speculation among fans that the Tyranids might eventually learn to exploit Necron tomb worlds in a very different way if they were unguarded. Even though Necron bodies hold no biomass, the worlds themselves are often rich in resources, minerals, and even captured relics from ancient times. A sleeping tomb world without active defenses would be easy prey for the Tyranids to strip bare of raw materials for their growing fleets. While it wouldn't feed the swarm in the biological sense, it could still give them valuable building blocks for their biovessels and planetary digestion pools. Ultimately, without the Necrons to slow them down, the Tyranids in this alternate timeline are not just stronger, they're far more widespread. Hive fleets that, in the real timeline, would have been ground down or destroyed before reaching their main objectives, could instead hit those objectives at full strength. This has a snowball effect. Each victory feeds the next, each devoured world making the next assault even more overwhelming. In a galaxy already struggling to fight them in fragmented, desperate campaigns, the removal of one of their most effective natural predators could tilt the balance dangerously in their favor. And once that momentum builds, it's hard to see anything short of the galaxy's combined might slowing them down. Without the Necrons stirring from their tomb worlds, the Orcs would find themselves with far fewer roadblocks in their endless quest for a good scrap. In the canon timeline, Orcs regularly run headlong into Necron territories and discover, often painfully, that their beloved Daka and Chappas don't make much of a dent against living metal and self-repairing constructs. Many great Orc wags have been stalled or outright destroyed when they accidentally awaken a dynasty. Without those sudden and brutally efficient counters, the Orcs would have a much easier time keeping their momentum going. Orcs thrive on momentum. Every successful campaign swells their numbers, bolsters their war machines, and draws more boys into the fight. Necron resistance tends to stop that growth cold, not because the Orcs lack the will to fight, but because the battles against Necrons often end without the kind of satisfying victory they crave. You can't loot a Necron's body for parts, you can't eat their squishy bits because there aren't any, and even when you kill them, they just vanish into green light. It's frustrating for an Orc warlord who lives for trophies and loot. In a galaxy without Necrons, every battle would yield something useful. Whether it's Imperial tanks to repurpose, Eldari skimmers to strap more guns onto, or Tyranid bio-beasts to turn into nightmarish living weapons. Another major change would be the sheer scale of Orc expansion. Right now, many Orc empires are hemmed in by dangerous borders, places they can raid but not fully conquer because the Necrons hit back with terrifying precision. Without that threat, Orc empires could expand deeper into the galaxy's rich populous regions. The result would be more massive, galaxy-shaking wogs forming faster than ever. Imagine something like Gazakul's Great Wog not just hitting Armageddon, but rolling across multiple sectors without pause, simply because nothing on the path was resilient enough to stop it in time. From a technological standpoint, the lack of Necron tech falling into Orc hands might seem like a disadvantage, but in reality, Orcs rarely get much out of it anyway. Necron weapons are too alien, too perfectly engineered for their crude, instinctive tinkering to fully exploit. Sure, a mech boy might weld a gas flare onto a truck, but it's never as devastating as it should be. Without Necron gear lying around, the Orcs would simply loot more from other enemies. Imperial plasma cannons, Tau railguns, Eldar shuriken weaponry, and those tend to integrate into Orc designs far more effectively. This could actually make Orc war machines more dangerous in the long run, because they'd be built from tech the mechs understand just enough to make even more destructive. The absence of Necron invasions also means Orcs wouldn't be forced to divert their forces to pointless, unwinnable wars. In the current timeline, some Orc warbands waste decades clashing with Necron dynasties over barren, resource-poor worlds that don't even interest them, simply because there's a fight there. In our alternate scenario, all of that energy gets redirected toward living, resource-rich targets. Hive worlds, agri-worlds, forge worlds. The Orcs wouldn't just be fighting more, they'd be fighting in places that actually matter strategically, which means the damage they inflict on the rest of the galaxy could be much more severe. Some fans like to speculate about what this would mean for the biggest, most infamous Orc warlords. Ghazghkull, for example, might have reached his current level of power even sooner, or perhaps even surpassed it, if he'd never had to waste time on dynasties that didn't give him the kind of war he wanted. Warlords like Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, who are more cunning than most, could carve out semi-permanent empires in the absence of Necron threats on their flanks. Even smaller, regional bosses could become legends faster, simply because they'd have more victories to their name without those dead-end conflicts. And then there's the cultural angle. Orcs are shaped by the fights they have. A galaxy without Necrons means a galaxy where Orcs are mostly fighting enemies who bleed, scream, and explode when hit, exactly the kind of visceral feedback they live for. This could make Orcs even more aggressive, because every victory would be satisfying, every battle a feast of noise and destruction. They wouldn't develop grudges against boring enemies like Necrons, which sometimes cause warbands to lose focus and wander off. Instead, every enemy would feel like worthier prey, which could make Orc wogs more focused and sustained. Without the cold, surgical counterpunch of Necron legions, the Orcs become a much wilder variable in the galaxy's balance of power. They spread faster, hit harder, and face fewer dead ends in their eternal warpath. It wouldn't make them smarter, but it would make them far more dangerous, because an Orc that never runs out of a good fight is an Orc that never stops growing stronger. Chaos operates on opportunity. The ruinous powers and their mortal servants are like predators circling a wounded animal. They strike when the prey is distracted, weakened, or unable to defend itself. In the galaxy we know, the Necrons are one of the many threats constantly draining the Imperium's attention, pulling fleets and armies into distant cold wars. On the surface, it might seem obvious that removing the Necrons would make the galaxy less vulnerable to chaos, because the Imperium could focus more on fortifying the Eye of Terror's borders and purging cult activity. But the reality, if you think about it, is far more complicated. One of the subtle effects the Necrons have on chaos is that they are a purely material, purely physical threat. They have no connection to the warp, no psychic presence, no demonic influence. In fact, some of their technology can actually disrupt or neutralize warp-based entities. When Necron forces are active in a sector, demonic incursions tend to avoid that space, not because chaos fears them in a human sense, but because the warp and the Necrons simply do not mix well. If the Necrons never awoke, those cold zones in the galaxy vanish, leaving the warp more free to bleed into real space in areas otherwise avoid. There's also the matter of timing. Without Necron invasions creating crises that demand urgent attention, the Imperium's armies might be more available for combating chaos offensives. That sounds like a positive, and in some cases, it would be. The Black Crusades might face stiffer resistance. Chaos warbands raiding into the Segmentum Obscurus might find fewer unguarded systems, and Daemon worlds might be isolated more effectively. But chaos doesn't just rely on brute force. They thrive on infiltration, corruption, and slow rot. A more stable Imperium without the distraction of the Necrons might also grow complacent. Its governors and admirals less aware of how fast the tendrils of chaos can spread when left unchecked. Fan discussions often point out that the Necrons, by their very nature, keep the galaxy's factions fractured. When an Imperial crusade is called to face a Necron dynasty, the Eldari sometimes join the fight, not out of loyalty, but because they also want the Necrons contained. This kind of rare, temporary alignment between enemies indirectly keeps chaos in check, because it channels forces into campaigns that deny chaos access to certain sectors. Without the Necrons forcing those alignments, the galaxy might fall back into even more bitter isolationism, giving chaos more room to maneuver without anyone else interfering. On a more esoteric level, there's the question of psychic warfare. Necron activity can disrupt the flow of the warp on a localized scale, sometimes unintentionally weakening demonic manifestations or cutting off cult leaders from their patrons. Some Necron war gear even has the power to sever the link between a sorcerer and the warp entirely. In a galaxy without them, chaos sorcerers, heretics, and daemon princes would have far fewer reasons to fear these kinds of sudden, inexplicable disruptions. The net effect could be that warp rituals are easier to conduct, demonic incursions last longer, and heretical uprisings escalate faster before the Imperium can respond. That said, there is a counterpoint. If the Imperium is not burning through fleets and regiments fighting Necron threats, it has more capacity to fortify sectors vulnerable to chaos. The Cadian Gate, for example, might have been reinforced even more heavily in the years before its fall. Imperial forces could have been more decisive in purging cults in frontier worlds or stopping the spread of warp storms before they became permanent features. Without Necron distractions, the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus might have more resources to dedicate purely to demonic threats instead of splitting its focus with alien machine legions. However, history in the 41st millennium shows that the Imperium rarely uses freed-up resources efficiently. Internal politics, corruption, and sheer bureaucratic inertia mean that even without Necrons, the High Lords might simply squander the opportunity. Chaos excels at exploiting that kind of inefficiency. A sector that was supposed to receive new defenses might see those supplies siphoned away for some unrelated war, leaving it open to a chaos incursion. And without the existential urgency that Necron awakenings inspire, many governors might underestimate just how quickly a minor cult can spiral into a full-blown heretical uprising. There's also an unsettling possibility that fans sometimes discuss. Without the Necrons, chaos might rise to become the undisputed final boss of the galaxy. Right now, the galaxy's horrors are spread across multiple apocalyptic threats: the Tyranids, the Necrons, Orcs, and so on. In a galaxy without Necrons, chaos no longer shares that spotlight and might receive a disproportionate amount of focus, both from a narrative and in-universe perspective. More mortal factions might turn to the ruinous powers simply because they don't have to fear the silent emotionless slaughter of the Necrons. It's a grim thought, but in some ways, the presence of Necrons forces certain worlds to cling harder to the Imperium, while without them, those worlds might gamble on chaos as the lesser evil in their desperate situations. Ultimately, whether the galaxy becomes more or less vulnerable to chaos in this alternate history depends on how disciplined the Imperium would be without the Necrons breathing down its neck. Judging by its track record, it's hard to be optimistic. Without those cold, soulless legions forcing humanity to stay sharp, the Eye of Terror might have found it much easier to cast its shadow across a galaxy unprepared for what was coming. In the absence of the Necrons, a very particular kind of power vacuum would open up in the galaxy, one that the younger races would be quick to notice. The Necrons occupy a strange niche in the galactic ecosystem. Ancient, advanced, and largely uninterested in diplomacy or trade, yet willing and able to sweep through territories and claim them with surgical precision. They are a threat that doesn't just conquer worlds, they erase them as functioning societies. Without them, other factions with expansionist tendencies would see vast stretches of space suddenly far more accessible. The most obvious candidate to step into that role would be the Tiao. In the real timeline, the Tiao's expansion is occasionally checked by contact with Necron forces, especially in regions where tomb worlds lie hidden near their borders. These encounters tend to be disastrous for the Tiao. Necron technology simply outclasses them, and their strategies, which rely heavily on mobility and ranged firepower, are often undermined by the Necrons' teleportation and resilience. Remove that obstacle, and the Tiao Empire suddenly has much more room to grow. They could push deeper into Imperial frontier space, swallow up smaller alien polities, and consolidate power without fearing the sudden appearance of an undying metal army to sweep away their gains. But wouldn't just be the Tiao. Other smaller or younger civilizations, ones we barely hear about in the canonical lore because they tend to get stomped by the Necrons, could flourish. Minor Xenos empires, nomadic fleets, and even isolated human breakaway states could expand into territories once protected by the fact that nobody wanted to risk waking a tomb world. Without that deterrent, these groups could become much more significant players in the galactic arena. Imagine a cluster of independent human systems in the Eastern Fringe forming their own mutual defense pacts, or a small but technologically sophisticated alien race suddenly finding itself controlling key trade routes that were previously avoided. The absence of Necrons would also give rise to a shift in how borders are drawn. In canon, many sectors are left deliberately underdeveloped or avoided altogether, because the risk of disturbing Necron crypts outweighs any economic gain. Without that looming threat, those sectors become prime targets for colonization. The Tau could expand their seps there. The Imperium could plant new frontier worlds, and other Xenos civilizations could carve out footholds. Over time, this would lead to more points of contact, and therefore more points of conflict between these younger powers. In a twisted way, the Necrons' presence actually kept some of these groups from clashing simply because their expansion paths were blocked. Another angle fans often discuss is how this would affect the balance of technological advancement. Necron technology is so far beyond most factions that there's little chance of reverse engineering it in a meaningful way. However, the wars against them often push other civilizations to innovate just to survive. Without that pressure, those breakthroughs might not happen, or, conversely, those resources might be spent on improving technology for expansion rather than for countering an immortal enemy. The Tau, in particular, could direct their R&D toward more ambitious projects like larger-scale colonization fleets, more advanced terraforming systems, and defensive measures aimed at human or orc threats, instead of gas weaponry and monoliths. Of course, there's also the possibility that the Orcs could fill part of that void. While they don't occupy territory in the same deliberate way as the Necrons, large Orc empires could become the new do-not-enter zones on the map if they expand into areas that would have been Necron-held. The difference is that Orcs are far more chaotic and, paradoxically, far easier to negotiate around for other races. They can be drawn away by a bigger fight, manipulated into attacking rivals, or simply burned out by constant warfare. Necrons, by contrast, are an implacable wall. Replacing them with Orcs shifts the galaxy's danger profile toward unpredictability rather than inevitability. Some fans like to point out that, without Necron interference, even the Eldar's younger offshoots, like the Exodites, might have more space to thrive. Worlds that in canon would have been sterilized by a tomb's awakening could instead become long-term Eldari colonies, subtly influencing trade and politics in nearby sectors. The younger races might not even notice the Eldari presence at first, but over centuries, these enclaves could grow into formidable powers in their own right. Ultimately, removing the Necrons means replacing an unfeeling, calculating predator with a dozen smaller, hungrier ones. The galaxy's middleweight powers would become bolder, their empires growing in ways that, in the current timeline, would be shut down before they ever became a threat to the galactic heavyweights. It wouldn't necessarily make the galaxy safer, it would just make it louder, more volatile, and perhaps more dynamic. Without the cold, metallic shadow of the Necrons hanging over them, these younger races would seize their chance to grow, and the results could be as explosive as any war the galaxy has ever seen. The Necrons' tomb worlds are more than just military fortresses. They are vaults of technology so advanced that most civilizations in the galaxy couldn't even begin to understand it. Their awakening in the canon timeline means these treasures are guarded, active, and used against anyone foolish enough to come close. But in a galaxy where the Necrons never rise, those tombs remain sealed and silent, their wonders lying undisturbed beneath the soil of countless planets. At first glance, this might sound like an incredible opportunity, a hidden inheritance of the galaxy's most advanced engineering just waiting to be claimed. The reality is much more complicated. Without the Necrons themselves to unseal and wield these devices, many of them might simply stay buried forever. Entire civilizations could live and die above them without ever realizing what lies a few kilometers beneath their feet. Mining operations might stumble across fragments, perhaps a shard of living metal or a strange humming artifact. But without context, these finds could be dismissed as anomalies or destroyed in ignorance. In some cases, they might be handed over to authorities like the Adeptus Mechanicus, who would then hide them away in sealed vaults, never fully able or willing to understand or replicate their function. One of the strangest things about Necron technology is that it isn't just better than anything else. It operates on principles that defy what most scientists in the galaxy think is possible. Instantaneous teleportation, weapons that unmake matter at the molecular level, self-repairing armor, and entire structures that phase in and out of reality are commonplace to the Necrons. Without their awakening, these marvels never become visible in a way that forces other factions to adapt or attempt to copy them. The galaxy might never even realize how far behind it truly is. Some fans argue that in this alternate timeline, the Imperium might still find ways to access some of these treasures. Rogue traders, archaeotech prospectors, and unsanctioned Mechanicus expeditions could quietly loot dormant tombs, especially if they don't trigger any automated defenses. This could lead to isolated leaps in technology, an Imperial Navy ship equipped with an impossibly efficient power core, or a planetary defense grid powered by an artifact older than human civilization itself. But without a widespread Necron presence, these discoveries would likely remain rare and hoarded, never influencing the galaxy on a broad scale. There's also the question of whether other races would be more successful at exploiting these dormant vaults. The Tiao, for instance, might be far more open to integrating alien technology than the Imperium. If they stumbled across a dormant tomb world, they might not destroy what they found out of superstition, but instead try to merge it with their own systems. The results could be transformative: faster-than-light communication, near-invulnerable armor plating, or weapons that could put them on a more equal footing with much older powers. In a galaxy without Necrons to stop them, such scenarios become far more plausible. However, the real danger of these sealed vaults lies in their potential misuse. Without the Necrons to defend their property, there's nothing to stop reckless hands from meddling with things they don't understand. Entire worlds could be destroyed by the accidental activation of a planetary defense system meant to repel an ancient enemy. A single recovered stasis field generator could end up in the possession of a warlord who uses it for mass imprisonment. The galaxy is full of people who would see Necron technology not as a responsibility, but as a tool for power. Without the Necrons to keep them in check, the number of technological disasters could skyrocket. Some even suggest that leaving this technology untouched might be the safer option. In the canon timeline, the Necrons use their own creations with frightening precision, but at least they understand them. In this alternate reality, these devices might fall into the hands of beings far less disciplined, far more desperate, and far more likely to cause chaos without realizing the scale of what they've unleashed. The irony is that the sleeping Necrons, in their own cold way, might actually be preventing worse disasters simply by existing to guard their ancient legacies. So while the absence of the Necron awakening means that these technologies remain locked away rather than turned against the living, it also means they don't drive innovation, don't reshape the arms race, and don't teach the galaxy just how much more advanced the ancient civilizations truly were. The great treasures of the war in heaven would simply gather dust in eternal darkness, their secrets fading into obscurity, while the younger races continue fighting with weapons that, to the Necrons, would look like sticks and stones. Removing the Necrons from the timeline doesn't just erase a few side conflicts, it tears out entire threads from the fabric of the 41st millennium's history. Some of the most famous battles in Warhammer lore either wouldn't happen at all, or would be so radically altered that their outcomes and the ripple effects they caused would change the galaxy in unpredictable ways. When you start thinking about specific examples, the scale of the shift becomes obvious. Take the War for Damnos. In the canon timeline, this was a brutal campaign where the Ultramarines faced the newly awakened Necron dynasty on the planet. It wasn't just another fight. It was a nightmare of technological superiority versus Astartes' determination, and it shaped how the Imperium viewed the Necron threat. Without the Necrons, Damnos would be just another Imperial mining world, maybe facing the odd Orc raid or local rebellion. There would be no dramatic retreat, no bitter lesson about the limits of even Space Marine power, and no lasting scar on the Ultramarines' reputation. Then, there's the fall of Sanctuary 101. This was one of the most chilling moments in Imperial history, when an entire convent of the Adepta Sororitas was wiped out almost to the last woman by a Necron force that appeared without warning. It became a rallying cry for the ecclesiarchy, and a grim reminder that some enemies cannot be reasoned with or stopped through faith alone. Without the Necrons, Sanctuary 101 might still stand, its sisters alive and serving across the galaxy. The ecclesiarchy would lose one of its most potent cautionary tales, and the sisters might never have been forced to adapt to such a cold, calculating enemy. The battles in the Pariah Nexus are another example. This whole theater of war exists because of the Necrons' expansion and their use of reality-warping technology to create zones hostile to psychic powers. Without their awakening, that entire sector remains a standard Imperial territory, never becoming a nightmare of null fields and impossible geometry. The Ultramarines, Deathwatch, and other Imperial forces assigned there would be free to serve in other war zones, potentially tipping the scales elsewhere. Some conflicts involving other factions would shift too. The Eldari's covert strikes to prevent tomb awakenings would vanish from their history, freeing their forces for more direct action against Orcs, Chaos, or even the Tyranids. The Tiau's disastrous clashes with Necrons, battles that often ended in near-total losses, wouldn't occur, meaning they'd preserve fleets and armies for expansion in other directions. This could mean entire Tau septs surviving and thriving that in the current timeline were shattered before they could grow. Even the Tyranids' invasion paths would be different. In the canon timeline, some hive fleets have been diverted or slowed by unexpected Necron resistance. Without that obstacle, key battles like the defense of certain Eastern Fringe systems might have been completely one-sided massacres, with Tyranids overrunning Imperial positions long before reinforcements could arrive. That shift alone could change the timing and nature of major Tyranid wars like the fight for Macragge, or the later stages of Hive Fleet Leviathan's spread. There are smaller but still important battles that would simply never occur. Countless random encounters where an Imperial force, Orc warband, or rogue trader stumbled into a tomb world would instead result in nothing more than an uneventful exploration or a battle with a more familiar foe. These seemingly minor changes add up. Commanders who died on Necron battlefields, might survive to lead future campaigns, and resources spent on hopeless fights could be redirected to wars that, in this version of history, have a better chance of being won. Fans also speculate on the knock-on effects for larger wars. Imagine if the Third War for Armageddon had more Imperial Guard regiments available because they weren't tied up fighting Necrons in other sectors. Or if the Black Crusades had faced stiffer resistance because the Imperium wasn't losing ships to sudden Necron ambushes in deep space. Without those distractions, the galaxy might look slightly less fractured, but perhaps also less tested. The Necrons, after all, force their enemies to think differently, to adapt to a type of warfare unlike any other. Removing those crucibles of survival might leave the galaxy's armies less prepared for other apocalyptic threats. In this alternate timeline, some of the most famous and defining moments in the lore either vanish or take on entirely new forms. What's left is a galaxy where certain heroes never become legends, certain tragedies never occur, and the lessons learned on the cold, silent battlefields of the Necrons are never taught. The question is whether that makes the galaxy stronger for not having faced those trials, or weaker for never having been tested against such an implacable, alien enemy. When fans talk about a galaxy without the Necrons awakening, the theories tend to range from grounded and tactical to wildly speculative and almost mythic. One of the most popular ideas is that the Silent King, even without the rest of his race waking up, might still act as a shadow player on the galactic stage. In this version of events, he never returns to lead his people openly, but instead uses hidden agents, sleeper constructs, and subtle manipulations to guide events towards some long-term goal. The galaxy never realizes a Necron hand is behind certain shifts in power, and their influence becomes almost conspiratorial. Less about open conquest, and more about shaping the conditions for a possible awakening far in the future. Another theory imagines that the Tomb Worlds, without ever fully activating, could still pose environmental and technological hazards. The Necrons might remain dormant, but their automated defenses could continue to operate on a low level, creating strange dead zones where ships vanish or technology malfunctions. In this version, the galaxy is haunted by ghost stories of cursed planets and derelict ships, but no one can prove the truth. These mysteries could spawn entire cults, Xenos religions, or Mechanicus expeditions obsessed with unlocking the secrets of these silent, lethal places. There's also a more optimistic take some fans like to explore, the idea that without the Necrons, the younger races have a much better chance of uniting against common threats. The Tau, for example, could bring more human fringe worlds into their fold without Necron interference, potentially creating a coalition strong enough to stand against the Tyranids or even resist the influence of chaos. In this scenario, the galaxy becomes more multipolar, with several mid-tier powers sharing influence instead of the eternal dominance of the Imperium, locked in endless wars with ancient, godlike enemies. On the flip side, a darker speculation suggests that removing the Necrons might make it easier for the Tyranids to consume the galaxy unchecked. Without the attrition of battles against living metal, Hive fleets would face fewer obstacles and arrive at key targets faster. In some fan scenarios, this leads to an almost apocalyptic timeline where the Tyranids advance so quickly that even the combined forces of the Imperium, Orcs, and Eldar cannot slow them. The galaxy falls not in the grim darkness of endless war, but in the cold silence of total biological consumption. A particularly strange but intriguing theory suggests that without the Necrons awakening, other ancient races might step forward to fill the narrative and strategic void. The Rock Ghoul, for example, those violent, marauding Xenos barely touched on in official lore, could expand far beyond their current borders. Similarly, the enigmatic Hrud, whose migrations already cause chaos wherever they go, could become a major power. This idea appeals to fans who want to see less explored parts of the setting take on a more prominent role. Some fans take the concept even further and speculate that the absence of Necron interference could allow the Imperium itself to evolve differently. Without the constant drain of resources into Tomb World conflicts and without the paranoia of an implacable machine enemy, certain factions within the Imperium, especially the Mechanicus, might be more willing to experiment, innovate, and even adopt alien technologies. In the most hopeful versions of this theory, the Imperium could advance technologically for the first time in thousands of years, breaking the cycle of stagnation. In the most cynical versions, this only accelerates the Imperium's eventual collapse, as new tech becomes a tool for internal power struggles. One of the most imaginative theories flips the premise entirely. The Necrons never awaken because they never went to sleep. In this alternate history, the dynasties remain active but dormant in influence, hidden deep underground or scattered in isolated pockets, quietly manipulating events while avoiding direct confrontation. Instead of being a known, visible enemy, they become the ultimate hidden masters of the galaxy, with every faction unknowingly playing into their long game. In this scenario, the galaxy's wars and politics are shaped not by the constant noise of open warfare, but by the subtle moves of a player no one even knows exists. What makes these theories so engaging is that they touch on one of the most alluring aspects of Warhammer 40k lore. The idea that the galaxy is so vast, and its history so deep, that removing or altering one thread can change everything. Whether the absence of the Necrons leads to a brighter, more unified galaxy, or a darker, faster apocalypse, depends entirely on which dominoes fans choose to knock over in their imagined timeline. It's a reminder that, for all their cold, mechanical inevitability, the Necrons are not just a faction, they're a gravitational force in the setting. Remove them, and the entire narrative map warps in fascinating ways. Looking back at this alternate history, it's striking how much the absence of the Necrons reshapes the galaxy. At first it feels like we're just removing one player from the board, but the reality is that this change sends ripples through almost every major power. Without the Necrons, the Imperium has more ships, more soldiers, and more time, but it also loses one of the sharpest reminders that humanity is not the oldest or most advanced species in the stars. That absence could make it stronger militarily, yet weaker in spirit, perhaps more arrogant or complacent. The Eldari would have their ancient trauma eased, free to act with less caution, but that very freedom could tempt them into the same kind of reckless expansion that once led to their fall. The Tyranids would likely become bolder and faster in their consumption, no longer forced to waste biomass against foes who offer nothing to devour. Orcs would find their wogs uninterrupted, rolling over sectors that would have been slowed or stopped by living metal defenses. Chaos might discover more fertile ground to spread its influence without those rare, accidental moments of unity between other races that the Necrons' return sometimes forces. Younger species like the Tau could surge ahead, filling the territorial and political gaps left behind, while countless minor civilizations, many of which barely get mentioned in the canon timeline, might rise from obscurity to carve out their own empires. The loss of the Necrons' awakening also means the galaxy's greatest caches of ancient technology remain hidden, sleeping under layers of rock and myth. Some of it might be found by chance, changing the fate of worlds or entire factions, but much would stay locked away, never forcing the galaxy to confront just how advanced its past really was. And then there's the absence of those key battles, the War for Damnos, the fall of Sanctuary 101, the horrors of the Pariah Nexus, all gone, replaced by different conflicts or none at all. Heroes who died in those wars might live on to fight others, and some of the grim legends that define the tone of the 41st millennium would never exist. What fascinates me most is how many of these changes cut both ways. On paper, the galaxy might seem safer without a cold, immortal empire of machine warriors claiming entire star systems overnight. But by removing that threat, we open the door for others to grow unchecked. The Necrons are a scalpel, precise, targeted, deliberate. Remove them, and the void they leave can be filled by blunt, chaotic forces like Orcs or Tyranids, or by the slow, corrosive spread of chaos. In trying to imagine a brighter galaxy without them, you start to realize that their presence, as horrific as it is, also acts as a strange kind of balance. They don't just destroy, they prevent certain things from happening, even if unintentionally. It's easy to see why this what-if captures the imagination of so many fans. It's not just about picturing battles that never happen. It's about reimagining the rhythm of the galaxy's wars, the rise and fall of powers, and the very identity of factions we think we know. Would the Imperium be the same without having fought and bled against a foe that feels like death itself given form? Would the Eldari lose some of their grim wisdom without a constant reminder of the war in heaven? Would the Tyranids, unopposed, devour so much that no alliance could ever stop them? There's no clear answer, and that's what makes the speculation so rich. If you've enjoyed exploring this alternate reality, remember that the galaxy of Warhammer 40k is vast enough for infinite what-ifs. Every faction, every battle, every ancient mystery can be twisted into a new shape with one small change in history. And if you want to keep diving into these kinds of deep, fan-driven explorations of the lore, make sure you subscribe, join the discussion, and share your own theories. After all, half the fun of this universe is imagining how it could have been if just one thing had gone differently.